Welcome to Chapter 6, Determining HR Demand. In this chapter, we are going to look at the processes that are involved in determining demand. If you recall, HR demand means we are determining what kind of resources we need to bring into the company, the number of people that we need to hire, and that feeds into our recruitment and selection process. So we're also going to talk about the fact that our HR plan and our forecasting also impacts through to looking at the supply, but for the most part we're going to focus on demand in this chapter. So we're going to look at some of the advantages and disadvantages of forecasting techniques. We're going to look at forecasting techniques that are quantitative, numeric in nature. We're going to look at some qualitative techniques that are involving the use of expert opinion and judgment. Alright, so let's get down to it. HR demand is the organization's projected requirement for human resources. So what we're doing here is we're trying to take the proverbial crystal ball and figure out or predict the demand for human resources, so the demand for workers. It's important to make sure that this is something that is done proactively because it's something that the organization needs to be able to do because they don't want to be caught off guard without the right people to do the jobs, because that can be very costly and detrimental. They also don't want to be caught with too many people because that can be equally costly and detrimental. So what we're talking about, of course, is a net surplus of employees means there's too many, and it can be a net deficit or demand if you have too short an amount of employees. So when we talk about demand, we're looking to make sure that we can understand and forecast the number of people that we need to hire over a given period of time, whether it's a year, 2 years, or maybe 5 years out. So fundamentally, there are two approaches to determining HR demand. One is quantitative in nature, and the other is qualitative in nature. So we're going to explore each of these areas. Quantitative is trend analysis, ratio analysis, regression analysis, looking at HR budgets, which is a dollar figure, and staffing tables. All of them are numeric in nature. Qualitative analysis involves using management judgment and creating scenarios and creating the what-if situation. Trend analysis is basically the idea behind trend analysis is that past patterns will predict the future. So if we think of what we know about the retail market and what we've talked about in terms of the patterns of peak and valley in staffing on a yearly basis in retail, we pretty well know that year over year that pattern or trend will repeat itself. So that's the idea, a historical relationship between something that's happened in the past and you can predict that in the future that's going to happen. So we know for North America, every year around Christmas time, we're going to have a peak demand for labor in the retail setting because we have to have more salespeople there because there's more shopping going on. So trend analysis also looks at the relationship between the size of your workforce and measures of operational efficiency, such as sales. So you would compare the number of sales that you had to the number of employees that you had, and that would show you how many thousands, for example, dollars of sales you get per employee. Set a target. You can certainly work backwards in your math to be able to figure out what kind of staffing or demand you have for staff. There are 5 steps to doing an effective trend analysis. The first step is actually choosing and predicting which business or operational index that you need. So whether it's sales volume or calls answered per minute or whatever the appropriate index is. Then you have to track that business index over time. So again, you can think of it sales per sales rep in a retail environment or in a corporate environment, tracked over the months of January through each month of the calendar year till December, and then January to December, year over year, and you start to understand the trends that you have January to January, comparing months and overall trends. Then you also track that workforce size over the same type of time frame, and it will help you to get to an understanding of what is going on over what periods of time historically, and then you use that to predict the future. Then you calculate the average ratio of the business cycle. So when we look back at this slide, we can see a ratio of the number of employees to the sales that they generate. So in 2009, there were 155 employees that generated a total of $2.8 million in sales, and it tells us that each employee generated 18,000 and change per employee. Then it seemed to go up a bit, and then it's flattened out. So we're able to look at some historicals. If 2012 is our current, we are able to look backwards and then project forwards and say, by the time we get to 2015, if we're projecting $3.850 million, we're going to need 207 employees if we're going to maintain a sales ratio of $18,640 per employee, and that's how it works. So ratio analysis is the second part of what we just talked about, where we look at the relationship between that operational index and the number of employees required. So trend analysis looks at, again, that pattern that happens perhaps year over year and the changes that happen. And then the ratio analysis is that idea that you can establish a relationship between an operational index and the number of employees typically required to get to that index. And again, the most common one tends to be. Then we can take it the next step, which is regression analysis. Regression analysis is, again, quantitative. It's the strongest predictive because it is, in fact, a model that is based on statistics. It uses statistical programming like SPSS or SAS to capture the data and create or generate a statistical model that actually gets us to a regression analysis. So then we can actually take it to the next step, and we can see a prediction model that looks a lot like the equation of a line. So you might think that Y is your dependent variable. So if you look in the pages in your textbook 143 to 146, you'll see some examples. Examples of what you might think of as Y is that HR demand. So how many personnel or how many people do you need to hire? Okay, and then your X variable or your causal variable could be something like your sales level or your production output. So again, regression analysis presupposes that there's a linear relationship between a causal variable and a dependent variable. So for our purposes, HR demand for personnel and something like sales or production volumes. So HR budgets and staffing tables go hand in hand. Quantitative in nature still, they're looking at relatively short-run demand estimates, and they're looking at it either from the whole organization or cascading through each department, each division, each boss saying, this is how many people I think I'm going to need, and it can either flow from top down in the organization or from bottom up, where the boss puts in, this is how many employees I think I'm going to need, and they start to add them all together. So then you get to the staffing table that gives you the overall total HR demand required for short run time periods. When you put all of these things together, you're able to get a cumulative effect and know collectively what the company is going to be needing in each area. So we've looked at our quantitative techniques or approaches: trend analysis, ratio analysis, regression analysis, HR budgets, staffing tables, different methodology, different data that you look at. Some are stronger than others in terms of their predictability. Regression analysis, if you can get it, is probably the strongest and is the most linear, saying if you need this many people and you have this amount of sales, then this is the formula you should follow. So let's take a look at some qualitative approaches that you can take as well. There's envelope and scenario planning, there's impact analysis, there's the Delphi technique, and the nominal group technique. Envelope and scenario forecasts look at projections. They make a set of assumptions. They make a set of different assumptions in how future events might unfold. So it's that kind of looking at it, the best case, worst case, and most likely case kind of scenarios. So this is an example of where you can look at it and say the optimistic, the adverse, and the most likely. Impact analysis is a method in which past trends are analyzed by experts, basically to learn from what worked right, what didn't work right. So it's a lessons learned type of a situation. And from that, they're able to predict future HR demand. So last time they did this, were they short-staffed? Or last time they did this, were they overstaffed? That kind of a philosophy. Okay. The Delphi technique is a process where you do forecasting and judgment. You use experts, people who have been around the world of HR for a while professionally, and line managers as well. Both are good to solicit for information. Okay. The Delphi technique is a technique that solicits or elicits feedback from experts, but it actually ensures that they don't have face-to-face interaction, so that they aren't influenced by each other, either by the forcefulness or personalities in the room, or perhaps there's some kind of adverse relationship, or there is a situation where people don't want to speak up because their boss is in the room and they may disagree with them, those kind of things. Okay, so it's a good way of generating ideas without people being influenced by general group dynamics. The disadvantages of it is it's very time consuming in terms of gathering the information. The fact that you're drawing on just experts as opposed to data can skew the results. And it may be that there's not enough attention paid to criteria that are needed in terms of, say, sales targets or something like that. So then you have the experts just looking and thinking rather than making some strong connection to some kind of business goal. So these are the steps that are involved in it. Okay, defining and refining the issue or the question, focusing on the timelines, okay, making sure that the people who are involved in it understand what they're supposed to do during the process. You issue a questionnaire, then you summarize the findings from that questionnaire, and you keep going through those process steps 4 and 5 until you get a conclusive recommendation. The nominal group technique. It's a long-run forecasting technique, again using expert assessments. The difference is that there can be the face-to-face meeting. So the process is very similar, but it's much more like a face-to-face meeting situation. And experts get to put their knowledge forward, they get to state their assumptions, they get to prepare, they get to meet face-to-face, and most importantly, and the difference between nominal and Delphi is that they actually get to discuss those estimates and perhaps be challenged on them, and they get to discuss and state what their assumptions are. But the important part of this is they actually get to vote secretly to determine what that demand assessment may be. So if there are differences in the forecasting numbers, the secret vote or the secret ballot provides people to give their most honest expert opinion and put that forward. So to summarize what we've learned in this chapter, we looked at different techniques used to forecast future demand for HR. We looked at index and trend analysis, which basically looks at historical relationships between workforce size and a measure of operational efficiency such as sales to determine the ratio between two measures for forecasting purposes. We realize that there's a number of experts that can be involved in the forecasting process. They don't necessarily need to be specifically HR staff. We looked upon different types of experts. We looked at the Delphi technique and the nominal group technique. And again, they're still looking to come up with numeric demand estimates, but they're not quantitative in nature in terms of the process that they go through. We looked at the difference between the Delphi technique and the nominal technique, looking for ways to ensure that their interpersonal or group dynamics don't skew the results. We talked about the budget process and producing staffing tables that are much more short run in their time horizons when they're planning HR demand. We looked at a staffing table in terms of presenting a prediction of the number of people that are required by department, by perhaps functional level, and understanding that there are a bunch of assumptions that go underneath that. We also looked at the idea of setting up possible scenarios for the future, worst case, best case, and most likely case. And we looked at envelope forecasting where there is a specific staffing table that can be tied to each corner. Again, the best, the worst, and mid combinations of the quadrants. And then finally, we talked about regression analysis, which is the strongest technique that you can use for forecasting. It's a simple regression line. Basically, it says that if you are looking to forecast your demand, you have a linear relationship between your demand for staff and a certain variable. And again, for example, you can use sales or perhaps output capacity or production volume. So we've looked at the techniques that are the first elements of HR forecasting. In Chapter 7, we're going to look at methods that we're going to use to determine supply, the sources of supply, and whether we look inside or outside the organization. So onwards and upwards to Chapter 7.